Hello, everyone. Uh, as Leslie said, I'm Matt Wagner. I'm one of your hosts for the Self Care Summit, along with Leslie. And together we formed Elemental to create spaces for people to transform. I'm so excited for all of you that have showed up here today in person. And likewise, I want you to know how grateful I am for those of you watching this recording in the future on your own time. I know there's a lot of you that can't be here today, so I'm grateful for you to be here and experience everything we have to offer. Thank you for spending your time with us. It truly means the world to us. It really does. It's our dream to live in a community of like-hearted people where we hold each other up and celebrate each other and living our best lives. We're passionate about ourselves and all of you living in your true elemental nature, or in other words, living in the fullest expression of your true self. We dream of a world where everyone belongs and has the opportunity to be loved and celebrated just for being themselves and feel safe to express themselves without judgment. Self expression is vitally important to self care. And I'm someone who spent the majority of my life up until this point stifling my self expression, living resentfully and angrily in a world of self censorship, perfectionism, performance, and pleasing, even while working very successfully in a business of helping others express themselves. And I was a designer for over 25 years and still am today. But today I'm here to talk to you about something that I have absolutely no training and no formal experience in whatsoever. I've only been reading about it for 6 years and attempting to do it for three, and that's even off and on. And I've really shared very little of it unless you're in my close personal world. And quite frankly, like never in a format like this. It's actually quite terrifying to be honest. But my lack of experience and my lack of knowledge and my lack of education and even severe imposter syndrome around this subject is the main reason why I'm doing this talk today. And it's about the power of reading, writing, and I've added speaking, poetry. Um, this is not just about the power of great poets, those that dedicated their life to the art and craft of this written form, some of which have changed my life, and I will share some of that today. But it's more about the power of actually writing poetry, specifically everyday poetry that comes from the depths of the heart without regard to the rules of judgment of academic or professional world or the good and bad judgment of literary criticism, right? Easily, more easily said than done. However, I believe that poetry, like all art, isn't reserved just for the great masters or those that have studied it academically. Creating art is deeply healing work. It's the art of writing poetry, like all art, is and should be for everyone, not just those deemed the creative or the artistic or the special ones. I'm not talking about winning a Pulitzer Prize or becoming the next poet laureate or getting published or anything like that in the world of achievement. I'm not even talking about joining a local poetry group or even calling yourself a poet in any way. These are all really nice things. If you're so called, go for it. I would encourage you to go after or participate in any of them. I think anybody is capable of doing anything they set their mind to. But no, today we're talking about self-care. And I found that reading, writing, and even speaking poetry to be a real tool for knowing myself on a deeper level. And it's helped me find ways to take care of myself and heal parts of myself through heart centered listening and self expression. And that's why we're all here at this summit. For those of us presenting to share our experiences, practices, and techniques for living a more attentive life. And those of you attending to gain inspiration and share in this communal effervescence as we support each other and taking better care of ourselves. I believe and have found that listening to ourselves and specifically what our heart is trying to tell us it wants is one of the most foundational forms of care we can give ourselves. But then when we're able to give what we hear a voice, either written or audible, the care multiplies and it becomes deeply transformational. The first poem I want to share is by the great German poet Rainer Maria Rilke. And this was the first poem I ever read where I felt really seen. The power of the great poets is their ability to capture the feeling in such a way that touches you on a deeply personal level, feels universal. And I think that I share the big poets because it's more of a aspirational thing, or a way to the way they capture the feeling is how I want to do when I'm writing, even just for myself. So this poem is called The Panther. From seeing the bars, his seeing is so exhausted that it no longer holds anything anymore. To him, the world is bars, 100,000 bars, and behind the bars, nothing. The lithe swinging of that rhythmical, easy stride, which circles down to the tiniest hub, is like a dance of energy around a point in which a great will stands stunned and numb. Only at times the curtain of the pupil rise without a sound, and then a shape enters, slips through the tightened silence of the shoulders, reaches the heart, and dies. And this is like, I read this in a long years ago when I first started reading poetry, and when I read this, it really kind of like captured maybe the way that I was feeling inside in a way that I couldn't express or had never seen expressed before. And this was ironically Rilke's first great poem, and was written from observing a panther in a zoo at the urging of the great sculptor Rodin. Before he wrote this, he had no success as a poet. He dreamed of writing great poetry and just couldn't do it. And he was working to report on the great sculptor Rodin's work, and was living and working in his studio. So Rodin would say good night to Rilke in the studio, and he would say bon courage, roughly translated to say show courage. What Rodin was trying to tell Rilke is that great deep expression would require courage. So we'll come back to that later. So before we dive into some more poetry, I want to first talk about the science of the heart and why it's so important for self-care. Coming into your heart is vital because you may not be aware that there are about 40,000 neurons in the heart. And that's right, neurons in the heart. I was stunned to learn this. It's sometimes even referred to by scientists as the little brain. This means that the brain isn't the only source or even the most central or powerful source of intelligence in your body. Unfortunately, the way human society has evolved and the nature of the Western culture specifically, we tend to focus almost exclusively on the intelligence of the brain, and our supremely powerful heart is often overlooked and devalued. This is even despite the fact that the heart is capable of emitting an electromagnetic field 100 times bigger than the brain. That's another statistic that kind of blows my mind. The Heart Math Institute has dedicated 34 years of scientific research into the study of the physiology of learning, resilience, and performance. Through all these years of developing reliable, scientifically validated tools that help people reduce and avoid stress while experiencing increased peace, satisfactory, and self-security, their research shows that adding our heart's energy into our daily activities and connections produces measurable benefits for our own and others' well-being. They found that the heart's magnetic field, which is the strongest rhythmic field produced by the human body, not only envelops every cell of the body, but it also extends out in all directions into the space around us. The heart's magnetic field can be measured several feet away from the body by magnometers. So the research they've conducted suggests that the heart's field is an important carrier of information, right? So we have this like powerhouse, intelligent source that's constantly vying for our attention, and we oftentimes ignore it or devalue it over the information that we're getting from the brain. The brain's important, the brain is important for sure, but the brain can also shut us down, tell us not to listen to our heart. It can tell us that what our heart is trying to say makes no sense, and that if we should be afraid of what it has to say. It tells us that what it has to say might be more than a little crazy, and God forbid we tell anyone what it's saying, because if they knew, they would just run away and never come back. And this is the voice of our conditioning. This is our societal indoctrination, or put more bluntly, our shame. When we listen to this voice, we suffer, and we're not taking care of ourselves. We shut ourselves down. We ignore large parts of ourselves. We can become discouraged, burned out, confused, depressed, and even violent, all depending on the way we're made and our life's experience. Holocaust survivor, psychotherapist, Dr. Edith Eger, who I love, she says the opposite of depression is expression. And that's a poetic statement right there, if I've ever heard one. And there's powerful truth to this. It's why I've devoted my life to walking with others in their journey of self-expression and creating spaces that give people, myself included, the permission to be fully themselves, no matter what it looks or sounds like. Now, don't get me wrong. It's going to take courage. We're going to come back to courage. In fact, the word courage comes from the Latin root word cor, which means heart. And I believe that taking care of ourselves in this day and age requires courage, and courage comes from the heart. And I believe that poetry is the language of the heart. My favorite living poet, David Whyte, has defined poetry as language against which we have no defenses. So to write poetry, we will render ourselves vulnerable. Brené Brown is one of the world's most foremost researchers on shame and vulnerability. And she says in her book, Rising Strong, that vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. Vulnerability is how we connect with ourselves and others. As humans, we're wired for connection, real, authentic connection. And vulnerability is a prerequisite for that connection. And connection is crucial to our survival and self-care as human beings. It's essential. So I'm making this case that poetry can be a very powerful tool for authentic connection, not only with yourself, and it always starts with yourself, but with others. One of the most famous American poets, E.E. Cummings, who was also a painter, essayist, author, and playwright, said, "We do not believe in ourselves until someone reveals that deep inside us something is valuable, worth listening to, worthy of our trust, sacred to our touch. Once we believe in ourselves, we can risk curiosity, wonder, spontaneous delight, or any other experience that reveals the human spirit." So all this being said, I'll now share my journey of healing through the power and connection of writing and speaking poetry, which for me, unbelievably, happened all at one time. My poetic journey started at Indigo Nature Retreat in Old Fort, North Carolina in 2022, deep in the heart of the Pisgah National Forest. It happened without warning and without trying. It came in a powerful flood of feeling, and the heart is the body's central feeling organ. So Leslie and I had created a retreat, and this retreat was incredibly special, not only because it was our first, but because of the incredible mix of people who showed up. Leslie and I had poured everything we had into this. We, even though we believed in ourselves, and in many ways we had no idea what we were doing, I know I was scared to death, and imposter syndrome was running rampant in my brain. I was struggling to settle into my heart and really afraid I would completely lose it, like with everything we had on the line, emotionally, financially, everything. Even up to a few hours before the event, we were completely unsure if most of our attendees were going to show up. And one of them was even lost and out in the wilderness with like no cell service. And one of the people who was a part of our retreat went out to find them, and we lost him too. So I was expecting the worst. And even in that deepest and dark places of insecurity and shame, not only did the worst not happen, but almost immediately, once my biggest fears didn't happen, immediately this group of strangers answered the call that Leslie and I were making, and even held me in this and reminded me of who I was throughout these first 2 days. It was an unspeakably beautiful, affirming, and healing. I felt seen, held, and brought alive by this group. They were showing me that following my passion by creating these retreat experiences was the right thing to do, even though it was unimaginably hard, and it almost made no sense. Overwhelming feelings of gratitude and love were rushing through me in a way, and in hindsight, in a way sort of like the flood that years later would rush through Indigo when the wrath of Helene made her devastating arrival through that property. In my case, it had a force that sort of laid to waste the barriers that prevented me from expressing myself, and then continued to arrive as uncontrollable tears as I actually read what I had written only hours later to the beautiful souls who revealed to me myself that weekend. So speaking in groups is actually, if not my biggest fear, one of my biggest fears, if not the biggest one. And I simply needed, quite literally, from the bottom of my heart, to express to these people what they meant to me as we were preparing to leave this transformative 4 days. So here's what I wrote. And just as a record, I've only read this one time out loud without crying. So bear with me. It's called Giving and Receiving. If heartbreak is the price you pay for love, then please accept my humble offering. All things come to an end, and all endings are also beginnings, but not all beginnings are the end. The light through the cracks illuminates our path home. These paths, now intersecting, we now must ultimately walk alone. We pack our bags, and in the space that remains from the things we leave behind, we now carry tiny pieces of each other. The weight is the same, yet somehow the load feels lighter. Alone and now, each in our own way, together. So Suleika Jaouad said in her newsletter called The Isolation Journals that cultivating a creative practice forges a sense of connection, a call and response, reverberations begetting more reverberations. It's how in the stories you share, I recognize myself, how that reflection makes me feel a little less alone. I cried pretty uncontrollably when I read that. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. I'd also never cried in front of people like that. It's the first time I did anything like that, but I got through it. And I learned in that moment there's something, actually, I take that back. I didn't get through it. We all got through it together. I got through it. They got through it with me. They got me through it. And I learned that in that moment, there's something about reading it out loud, something about the way your own voice vibrates in your body as you speak the words that they become physical. As Suleika said, reverberations begetting more reverberations. It's deeply healing. It's amazing what the power and connection with others in a safe space can create. I literally woke up abruptly in the middle of the night, and these words just flowed out of me, almost fully formed and completely in order, as if my heart was writing it for me, guiding my fingers as I typed. I was like feverishly in the dark in our camper van, trying not to wake Leslie in those tight quarters. We needed our rest. It's a lot, and I'm in there like trying to type this thing out and capture. I just like shot up out of bed and just did it. It was like a movie. I didn't care if it was good. I didn't care if I was a poet. I didn't care what anyone thought in that moment. I just had a need to express myself in this very specific way, and giving and receiving is what came from that feeling. Eric Rittenberry, who I love, he's the voice behind a Substack called The Poetic Outlaw, says if you write for applause, admiration, or the hollow idol of approval, your words are already dead. Writing, genuine writing, must be born from necessity, from an urgency that aches within and demands release. It's not a performance, a sideshow act, but a liberation. And these last words I love a lot, a breaking free from the silent prison of the self. And I think that is harkens back to the Rilke poem, this sort of silent prison, that this panther was in. It was in this zoo, and he recognized it. He saw it in himself. He passed it forward. I saw it in myself, and it was a catalyst for change. So in my life's journey to that point, I had let self-consciousness, my perfectionist tendencies, my inner critic, my shame, or whatever name or form you wish to call it, went out for too long and keep me in the silent prison of the self. Up until that point, I loved poetry. I'd read it, I'd studied it, I'd discussed it, I'd shared it. I was dramatically and powerfully changed by it, but I would never dare attempt to write it. And I was suffering it for it in ways that I didn't know. So my story above's dramatic, and it doesn't need to happen in that kind of way. I think mine's dramatic because I was so dramatically repressed, and then had such a dramatic change in my life that was so big and broad and sort of instantaneously, and went straight into this life that was so different from what I had before. And it just like came out of me like this, like it doesn't have to happen that way for everybody, and it doesn't need to, and it's only interesting from my own personal story. But stepping back many years, my first conscious interaction with poetry came from music. And as someone who was born in the 70s and came of age in the 90s, I was moved by very diverse musical genres. I loved most all music, and I've always been drawn to great songwriters. And one songwriter in particular, because of my particular time in the world, that I've always felt a deep, soulful connection to, is Eddie Vedder. There's an obscure little song, easily overlooked, even though it leads off his band Pearl Jam's fourth album, apparently, and it's appropriately enough titled "No Code" is the name of the album, which is great for this talk. Um, but while I was writing this talk, it kept coming to me. The songs kept coming to me, and I'm going to just share a selection of the lyrics here that I think are inspiring and speak of a way of being that is important to cultivating a writing practice. The song is called "Sometimes." Seek my part, devote myself, my small self, like a book amongst the many on a shelf. Sometimes I know, sometimes I rise, sometimes I fall, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I cringe, sometimes I live, sometimes I walk, sometimes I kneel. Sometimes I speak of nothing at all, and sometimes I reach to myself and hear God. There's something in this that's so real, so true, so compassionate and forgiving, while all at the same time a call to action, a reminder to keep living, keep trying, keep looking for the unexplainable and universal that resides in us all. Even though we're all trying, even though we're going to fail a lot and life is very unpredictable, like sometimes you just never know what's going to show up. And I know God can be a difficult word for some. It is for me. When I speak of God or hear others speak of God, my self-care practice calls me to picture this unexplainable, unifying, organizing principle and life force that resides in each and every one of us and everything. I encourage anyone here to picture whatever, whoever, or whatever feels like love to you, and that's what I'm speaking of. After writing my first poem, it felt so good and I wanted to keep writing. But as Eddie Vedder describes, and sometimes it was like a roller coaster ride, rising and falling, sometimes not knowing, sometimes speaking of nothing at all. In that moment, when I reached to myself and heard God in that moment, I knew what it felt like. And I wanted more of that feeling. While I was still residing more in my heart and in the wake of this beautiful retreat, I was able to write a little bit more, but soon the brain took back over as it does. Cue the Star Wars death march here. Um, and I began to get back into my head. My brain was blocking my connection to myself or my connection to what feels universal and loving. Being back in the world outside of the retreat, imposter syndrome started to get a foothold. And if I'm being honest, my ego, which resides in the brain, was gaining more control. I had to learn to surrender the ideas that I had about myself, and somehow my writing practice kind of saved me. One of the main reasons I write poetry is for those elusive aha moments or epiphanies. One epiphany I had about my ego getting in the way of my writing, otherwise known as writer's block, turned into a haiku. If you've never tried writing poetry, and that's one of the things I want to kind of encourage people to do just for themselves, haiku is a great way to begin. It's a simple but challenging puzzle that conforms to a formula or a syllable count. It's a 5-7-5 format where the first line is 5 syllables and the second line is 7. And then the third and final line is 5 syllables again. The results can be very powerful if you're centered in your heart when you begin. Here's the first one I ever wrote about writer's block, which I was referring to, but as in all things that come from the heart, it's about much, much more than that. So I titled this one Deafening. Your need to be heard is drowning out the sound of your actual voice. So in this piece, I used a technique called distanced self-talk, which involves using non-first person pronouns. Non-first person pronouns are he, she, they, or in this case, you. This created a psychological distance that allowed me to view myself and my experience with more objectivity and less emotional reactivity. So in other words, it helps me write about the hard stuff, where true healing and self-care happen. The shortness of the haiku and the language that I use to describe allowed me to imagine this wise sage or Buddha-like character deep inside of me that was granting me this deep wisdom. I do believe we all have this inside of us waiting to come out. We just have to find a way to tap into it. Distant self-talk really works for me, so it might be something that works for you. This piece served two purposes for me. It helped me understand what was happening inside of me, how I was self-censoring because I thought I wasn't good enough to write poetry, and redirect me towards my why, which was to connect with myself and hopefully have the opportunity to share with others. The point was to express myself from the heart not to receive accolades for my writing or simply to stop trying. It just was a reminder to simply stop trying so hard and just feel. And after writing it, I still did want to impact others in the way that it impacted me. So I turned it into a series that's still kind of ongoing, using the same the distance self-talk technique to write reminders to myself about staying humble, stop trying so hard, and to work to feel more than I think. So I've called these kind of jokingly, it's a kind of a half joke, self-help haiku. So here's another one, and I call this question to self. What if you haven't fooled anyone and, in fact, are that powerful? And then I've got another one called Hostage to Fortune. And it's unfortunately, which I was really proud of myself for a 5 syllable single word intro. Unfortunately, the change you seek only comes in the way that you need. And so these are, in a way, haiku are of fun puzzles. And I think they promote heart brain coherence, or at least a healthy conversation between the head and the heart, which I think is essential to any self care practice. When I write them, I'm more keenly aware of using my heart to feel and then using my brain to interpret and think about the syllable count, then go back to the feeling and back to the brain as I work to solve these puzzles of the heart. Sometimes I can do them in one sitting, and sometimes it takes days or weeks to solve it. I actually haven't written one in months, and that's okay. So let's take a little break here for a simple demonstration. Even though it seems like we've kind of maligned the brain a bit so far here, we do need the brain for paying attention. In order for us to make sense of what we're feeling, which is part of the healing process, we need to use it to bring more awareness to the heart. We have these deeply powerful and transformational experiences that drop us into our heart in a powerful way, like I've described. But on a day to day basis, when we're in the middle of our sometimes hectic and busy lives, we need a practical tool to train our brains and our hearts to work together. Heart brain coherence can happen in many ways. And I think heart brain coherence is a big part of self care. But I would like to walk you through like a short and useful exercise to quickly bring about and demonstrate this feeling and begin to train yourself to tune into the heart. So if you feel comfortable, close your eyes. Or if you don't feel comfortable closing your eyes, just direct your attention inward, direct your attention just inward into your body. And now place your attention on your physical heart, the actual organ. Just place your attention there, visualize it. You can put your hand over your heart too, which helps to sort of locate it and put a little pressure there. And now just start becoming aware of your breath and breathe in and out, imagining your heart as if it's your lung. Imagine the air moving in and out of your heart. Keep your focus on your heart and just picture your heart producing your breath. Breathe in for a 5 count and exhale for a 5 count. So we'll breathe in, 2, 3, 4, 5, and breathe out, 2, 3, 4, 5. And do this, keep doing this. And as you're doing this, recall someone or something or a place that brings you deep appreciation, gratitude, and love. And keep breathing, picturing that heart, feeling that heart, just leaning into something that just makes you feel loving, gratitude, appreciation. And hold on to that image in your mind as you breathe in and out of your heart and you feel this life force moving in and out of your heart. Now, drop the image and just focus on the feeling. Hold it there. Keep breathing. And now slowly direct your attention back into the world and thank your heart for its wisdom. Try to practice this regularly, or even right before you want to sit down to write or do any kind of creative process, or even just need to tune in or feel why you're feeling a certain way about something. Or even if you feel off or confused or just have a feeling that something isn't right, your intuition is trying to tell you something. Take a few minutes to tune in and see what comes up. So when we have heart-brain alignment or coherence, we're able to create with clarity and learn something about ourselves. David Whyte, again, says, poetry is often the art of overhearing yourself say something you didn't know you knew. It's a learned skill to force yourself to articulate your life, your present world, or your possibilities for the future. In last year's version of this very event, Leslie and I hosted last year. One of our presenters and dear friends, Casey Fanton, asked us to write a letter to ourselves from unconditional love, as if unconditional love was a person and it was writing us a letter. In that letter, I wrote something that kind of blew me away. I had no idea I knew this. And I, as David Whyte said, and I would never have discovered it if I hadn't taken the time to write from the heart. Journal writing is a great way to tune into the heart, and I have found it's a great way to mine your subconscious for ideas. Sometimes sitting down to write poetry is intimidating, but sometimes very poetic things come from simply letting go and writing from the heart. And a good journal prompt can get you into the heart quickly. In my letter to unconditional love, unconditional love said to me, and this is part of a bigger thing, but pain and suffering are a natural part of life that you cannot do anything about. You've been through a lot in your life, but the pain and suffering that you have experienced is not your punishment. I kind of sat there stunned after writing that. And because of how I felt saying it, I took the time to add it to a folder I keep on my phone that I call bits and pieces. So, more on that later. We'll come back to that. While I was in that file, I reread some other thoughts and feelings that I had in there about the nature and truth of the concept of resistance. And I saw a connection that spoke to me. It may not make sense to anybody else, but it spoke to me. And I turned it into this poem I call Birthright. The ease I seek is propelled by resistance, beyond judgment, but not consequence. To live without resistance is not to live at all. Pain and suffering are my birthright, but not my punishment. Saying that to myself and then saying out loud that my pain and suffering are not my punishment was profoundly healing. And because I've written it here and in this poem, I now carry it with me and continue to be reminded of it and healed by it over and over again. Up until this point, most of what I've shared with you has been heavy. And maybe it's because of how I'm wired or my particular life experience, but I do gravitate towards the darker side of life when I write. And I do gravitate towards darker art and music and by others in general. It's always seemed to me that the darker sides of ourselves are the ones that we hide from ourselves and from each other. So I focus here is a lot. I focus here as it's a source of powerful energy to the potential to heal through expression. However, if we're truly to take care of ourselves, I do believe that balance is sometimes important, and it will serve us equally to place our attention on things that fill our hearts with great joy and light. Brené Brown taught me that we hide our greatest joys so often because our fear of being called out, that joy is deeply vulnerable place. If we show people what brings us joy, they will then know exactly how they can hurt us. This is where vulnerability and courage come in. It's unavoidable in the act of self-care, whether you're going towards the dark or the light, vulnerability is unavoidable. So to care for ourselves, to find real connection and healing for ourselves, and especially in connection with others, we must find joy and surrender to it. Where there are many ways to do this, I find that my writing practice is a great way to cultivate it. Brené also says that joy and vulnerability, that joy is not a constant. It comes to us in moments, often ordinary moments. Sometimes we miss out on the bursts of joy because we're too busy chasing down the extraordinary moments. Other times, we're so afraid of the dark that we don't let ourselves enjoy the light. A joyful life is not a floodlight of joy. That would eventually become unbearable. I believe a joyful life is made up of joyful moments, gracefully strung together by trust, gratitude, and inspiration. So, this brings me to another writing practice I like to employ on occasion, and that's simply to go out, get quiet, and observe in nature And it requires all three of what Brené mentioned: trust, gratitude, and inspiration. Here's a wonderful and wise poem from the great Mary Oliver titled The Invitation. That's not only a beautiful poem, but instructional at the same time as to what I'm talking about and what Brené is talking about. So I'll read it here. It's called The Invitation. Oh, do you have the time to linger for just a little while out of your busy and very important day for the goldfinches that have gathered in a field of thistles for a musical battle to see who can sing the highest note or the lowest or the most expressive of mirth or the most tender? Their strong, blunt beaks drink the air as they strive melodiously, not for your sake and not for mine and not for the sake of winning, but for the sheer delight and gratitude. Believe us, they say. This is a serious thing. Just to be alive on this fresh morning in this broken world, I beg of you, do not walk by without pausing to attend to this rather ridiculous performance. It could mean something. It could mean everything. It could be what Rilke meant when he wrote, "You must change your life." As a side note, in this poem, Mary Oliver repeats a famous line by Rilke, who wrote The Panther from the beginning of this talk. And if anyone's taking notes, I highly recommend the book Letters to a Young Poet as a companion to any creative practice, and just life in general. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, and especially if you want to write. But back to writing from observation. Last year, I went for a silent walk around town where I live, New Harmony, Indiana. I went with the intention to write from observation. It was a sunny day and I was sitting on the edge of a wall in a space called the Roofless Church. I was overlooking a farm field that is in the floodplain of the Wabash River, which is approaching us right now. I sat there in silence, feeling gratitude and simply observing and feeling. I noticed movement and I followed it with my eyes. I noticed myself making assumptions about that movement, and I decided to write what I was experiencing, or in other words, seeing and feeling. This is what came of it. I call it, I thought it was the clouds. I thought it was the clouds. It was the trees. The mind plays tricks if you give it time. Shadows dancing on edges of delicate tassels. I want to be tricked. The bell rings. I thought it was the birds. This poem always brings me back to that moment, and it makes me feel good. Being in awe of nature, and maybe even more specifically, being of nature, and at the same time, in the simplest of ways, brings me back to my foundations as a human being. Reliving this beautiful day and my revelation of wanting to be tricked. That was the thing that I didn't know I knew, that I wanted to be tricked. And the novelty of it, the beauty and wonder of not knowing or thinking you know, and being reminded that curiosity is much more fun, and how we go about it is like, can go on and on and on as long as you let it. There are deeper levels of self-care when you allow and trust yourself to not know and just be astonished at what happens. Speaking of what I don't know, since that's what I'm doing here, here's another of my observational poems from the same physical space, but on a different day and in a much different context. And I call this one Blissful Ignorance. He says, in a generously apologetic tone that comes from well-earned knowledge, a rose that's suited for these harsh conditions isn't as fragrant. And as the disembodied bloom, defiantly heavy from hundreds of delicately impregnated layers, passes from him to me to her, my ignorant palate delights in the divine scent of spring. The perception of lack thankfully necessitates an exaggerated intimacy that reveals a beauty in the details easily overlooked at a more comfortable distance. And for the moment, as the warmth from the sun intensifies the fragrance, I'm blissfully unaware of what a more suitable condition might have brought. Now, these two poems are in some ways outliers. A lot of times, even if I go to write, I may not write anything at all, or at least not a full poem. Like, I can go out these days, it just happened to work for me, but I go out a lot and like nothing happens. The important and caring thing I do for myself is to just go out, be quiet, and observe, to listen to myself and let things happen naturally. I have an unexpected side project that emerged from my desire to write poetry that's been very instructional and healing for me. And it's this bits and pieces folder I was talking about earlier. If I'm feeling something strongly or notice something that makes me feel a certain way, or I'm going through something emotional, I'll sometimes write down the words that come to me. Sometimes these bits and pieces turn into a full length poem. Other times I find a way to turn them into a haiku, but sometimes they just sit in that folder. And perhaps most importantly, in my consciousness when I go back and look at them, because I know I can, and I do on occasion. The important thing is that I get the words down before I lose them, and more importantly, the feeling. And I've lost a lot of words by not doing this, and a lot of feelings by not doing this. If I do eventually find a way to weave them into a final poem, it has a better chance of retaining the power of the original feeling. And if not, at least I remember what I felt and I can return to it later. I feel like even though I'm not writing a poem per se, I'm capturing something that is poetic to me, which is more the point. When I come across something that lights me up, that pings my curiosity or wonder, that chokes me up or causes me to be still and pay attention, anything like that, I try to write it down so I can so it can remind me of the corresponding feeling. This to me is also using poetry as self-care, even if you're not writing poems. Some examples is one example I call shared but not diminished that I've been trying to turn into a poem forever and I haven't been able to do it. But it came to me from watching a candle being lit from another candle. It felt like magic to me, and it represented an invisible abundance that's all around us. This flame touches a wick and makes another perfectly equal flame without changing the other flame at all. How sharing can happen without losing or giving up anything, that sounds like self-care to me. A moment where my partner Leslie told me when I couldn't sleep one night that sleep would find me. And I thought about how I was covering myself up with fear and anxiety and a busy mind, and I needed to uncover myself and expose myself so sleep could actually find me, like literally find me, and how it parallels with the concept of putting on too many covers and waking up all sweaty and unable to sleep because you didn't know that you needed that cold in the moment. And a moment where I was watching hens in a chicken coop at one of our retreats, and I wrote that the mother hen waits, but still she must feed herself. This is directly about the nature of self-care and sometimes seemingly difficult choices we must make in our lives when it comes to taking care of ourselves and taking care of others. I guess maybe that could be a short poem, but it just it feels unfinished to me. So maybe at some point I'll do something with it. But in closing, I want to share two poems. First, one of my longer poems, especially since most of what I'm sharing has been very short, mostly to encourage you just to write what you feel, and it doesn't have to be this big thing. It doesn't have to be meaningful and powerful. It can just be anything. But I also want to demonstrate another technique that I use to help deal with a potentially difficult or challenging feeling. And I call this one personification. In this poem, I entitled Enduring and Beautiful, I'm coming to grips with with understanding the feelings I was having after visiting the city of Memphis. And then the ensuing conversation I had with someone I met who was born and raised in Memphis about his feelings and experience being from there. Memphis has a particular kind of complexity to its story. And the only way I could come up with to process the emotions I was carrying was to think of it as a person and write to them. And here's what emerged from that exercise. And just so y'all know, enduring Memphis actually means enduring and beautiful. The That's actually what the meaning of the word Memphis, which I learned in writing this poem. You wear a tragic story on your starched and pressed sleeve, a story as uncontrollable as cells violently dividing and multiplying in your body against your will. A story that started as a gunshot and reverberates like a gong the size of the universe. You think, but you cannot allow yourself to say out loud, this is not my story. A story you'd rather not tell, rather had not have had to tell. With red carpet now unrolled, you're faced with the troublesome knowledge that healing occurs in the telling, or rather in the listening, or rather in the believing. A believing that shouldn't have anything to do with the expanse of the truth of your genius. A genius that is still visible and emanating through the gaps between the clouds, like the sun, that's always behind the painfully slow moving and swirling storm front of misunderstanding, enduring and beautiful in the brutal and seemingly impossible trying, a trying to live with a story that must be seen to be believed and yet can never be seen completely. And finally, I'd like to leave you with a poem by my favorite living poet, a poet whose words changed my life, and whose poem, The Well, is an inspiring piece about the process of writing for self-discovery, otherwise known to me as self-care. And this poem is called The Well, and it's by David Whyte. But the miracle had come simply from allowing yourself to know that this time you had found it, that some now familiar stranger appearing far inside you had decided not to walk past it anymore, that the miracle had come in the kneeling to drink and the prayer you said and the tears you shed and the memories you held and the realization that in this silence you no longer had to keep your eyes and ears averted from the place that could save you, and that you had the strength at last to let go of the thirsty, unhappy, dust-laden pilgrim that brought you here, walking with her bent back, her bowed head, and her careful explanations. No, the miracle had already happened before you stood up, before you shook off the dust and walked along the road beyond the well, out of the desert and on towards the mountain, as if home again, as if you deserved to have everything you had loved all along, as if just remembering the first fresh taste of that clear, cool spring could lift you up to your face, to the morning light, and set you free. So, in a world that often demands so much of us, poetry offers a refuge, a space where we can slow down, reflect, and reconnect with ourselves through reading, writing, and speaking. We cultivate self-awareness, express emotions that might otherwise remain unspoken, and find solace in the beauty of language. Poetry is not just an art form, it's a lifeline, a means to self-care that reminds us of our resilience, our creativity, and our shared humanity. Whether we find comfort in the verses of others or craft our own, poetry has the power to heal, to inspire, to illuminate the depths of our heart. So I encourage you, make poetry a part of your daily life. Read a poem that speaks to your soul. Write without judgment, letting your emotions take shape on the page. Speak your truth, knowing that your voice matters. In doing so, you're not just engaging with poetry, you're embracing yourself with kindness, compassion, and care. Thank you.